It's great to be in this wonderful college hall where I have been as a young teacher 40 years ago. So lovely to be back, though I have been coming here on and off. Good evening. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who is delivering the 21st Dr.Asghar Engineer Memorial Lecture. Professor Mehta is very well known and respected for his scholarly writings, but equally for engaging with their implications for public policy and also for making them accessible to a broader audience through his regular columns in well-known newspapers and magazines, and I'm sure each one of you here would have read one or the other of his columns, if not more. His work has traversed many areas, including political philosophy, social theory, constitutional law, governance and political economy, international affairs, public policy, society, politics and religion in India, and Indian public institutions. To convey the complex arguments of a scholarly enterprise to a general audience without losing intricacy and subtlety is a skill that only a few like Professor Mehta can claim to possess. Professor Mehta is a political scientist who studied at Oxford and Princeton and who has taught at Harvard University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the New York University School of Law. Currently, he is consulting editor for Indian Express and is on the faculty of Princeton University. Previously, he has been Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University and President of the Center for Policy Research. He has served on many central government committees, providing critical inputs to public policy. These include India's National Security Advisory Board, the Prime Minister of India's National Knowledge Commission, and a Supreme Court-appointed committee on elections in Indian universities. He has also been a Fellow of the British Academy and of the Social Science Research Council and a recipient of the Infosys Prize. He is a prolific writer of articles, essays, and books. I will just mention the titles of a few recent ones. Hindu Nationalism, From Ethnic Identity to Authoritarian Repression, 2022. Rethinking Public Institutions in India, co-edited with Devesh Kapoor and Milan Vaishnav, 2017. Navigating the Labyrinth, Perspectives on India's Higher Education, co-edited with Devesh Kapoor, 2017. And the Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution, co-edited with Sujit Chowdhury and Madhav Khosla, 2016. His forthcoming work looks at philosophical ideas about religion in 20th century India. While Professor Mehta's work has indeed covered a variety of themes and issues, there are some abiding concerns that recur in his work. One is to elaborate an idea of liberalism that differs from interpretations of both the left and the right. There are some departures from Nehruvian liberalism. Individual freedom and choice are core themes. The state and law should empower individuals rather than groups. He is critical of the politics that creates categories that mold social reality. Yet he has a deep understanding and is respectful of India's cultural and religious mores. For him, democracy lies not merely in elections, but in institutions that mediate electoral power. So his approach does not fit easily into conventional political or ideological categories. Time and again, he has shown the courage and willingness to pay the price of speaking truth to power. I trust that this very brief summary is not a summary representation and not an inaccurate representation. We at the Center for Study of Society and Secularism, as Neha and Professor Puniyani said, we are very involved with issues of equality, justice, and secularism. While our activities and activism have a clear focus on fostering what is commonly considered or understood as a secular approach, we are always grappling conceptually with its ramifications, contradictions, and limits. We greatly look forward to Professor Mehta's lecture to provoke us, to enlighten us, and to lend us fresh energy and insights. It is now my privilege to introduce the chair for today, Dr. Puniyani, who is well known to all of you as the president of the Center for Study of Society and Secularism. He is associated with many initiatives in the cause of secularism. He is known for his writings on the topic of secularism through his articles and essays, which regularly appear in Indian magazines and newspapers. He has also served as part of an Indian People's Tribunal that investigated the violation of rights of minorities in Orissa and Madhya Pradesh. He regularly conducts seminars and workshops on topics related to the threat of communal politics, human rights, values of secularism, the Uniform Civil Code debate, the partition tragedy, Kashmir issue, and others. Dr. Puniyani has received several awards, including Maharashtra Foundation Award for Social Awareness about Threat of Communal Politics in 2002, National Communal Harmony Award 2007, and the National Confederation of Human Rights Organizations Mukundan C. Menon Award 2015. I now hand over the proceedings to Dr. Puniyani.
Thank you, Dr. Ganesh. Dr. Mehta, can I invite you for your delivering your speech? The floor is all yours.
Shri Puniyani, Dr. Irfan, engineer, Professor Kamla Ganesh. I must confess, it's very intimidating being here because I'm standing in St. Xavier's College. I went to St. Xavier's School, and so whenever I enter any precinct named St. Xavier's, I always have this image of being reprimanded and not found good enough after the homework has been done. So I'm not sure I've done enough homework to warrant this honor and privilege. It's of course also intimidating because we are here to honor, celebrate, and be inspired by Dr.Asghar engineer's life. And these days when somebody asks the question, to use Lenin's phrase, what is to be done? I think there's only one word answer one can give, and that is embodied in Dr. Asghar engineer's life. I think it's a word that's already been used twice, which is, you just have to show courage. I think fundamentally, if we are trying to find answers in other than our own actions and courage, we are probably trying to find an excuse not to do something. And I think Dr. Asghar engineer's life, demonstrates that with ample measure. That's always been, in a sense, the simplest theory of change, right? If somebody is looking for a reason to do something, you can be pretty sure they don't want to do it. I must also confess, at this historical juncture, I'll share a little bit of personal angst with you before launching into the lecture, as it were, the theme of the lecture. We are at a kind of historical juncture where when we meet like this, when we talk in classrooms, when we do what professors normally do, which is read texts, discuss arguments, you have this gnawing feeling at the bottom of your heart. What is this all aiming at, right? And this is true for one peculiar reason. Academics should never aim to be influential or bring about change. I'm actually a firm believer in the ivory tower, by the way. I think it has its own place. I think the world of politics and the world of social activism can be informed by ideas, but these are two distinct realms with different grammars, different responsibilities, you might say different ethical orientations. But the gnawing sense of unease these days is whether we are living in a world where almost all the presuppositions of communication seem to have vanished, right? You will say X, it will be taken to mean Y. All communication presupposes a context. conditions under which particular utterances make sense, right? We are living in a communicative context where all kinds of contexts have been collapsed into each other, right? Even the most virtuous, well-meaning, benign statement, right, in some senses can trigger a response that was not it's almost like saying, if I want to compliment somebody and they always hear it as an insult, how do you even begin to break down that kind of crisis of language we are in? Language is now a tool of fighting. It's not a tool of communication and understanding. And every time we speak, every time we write, every time anybody says something, we are kind of acutely self-aware of what kind of a speech act is this, right? How will these words, in a sense, be taken up? The second sense of unease, this is not unease really. Our topic of discussion today is in part informed by the brilliant work of CSS and the legacy of Dr. Engineer that we are trying to carry forward, which is the political project of secularism. And again, it is one of those moments where you wonder what else can be said about secularism that has not already been said, right? I think to put it very simplistically, yes, secularism is a very complicated idea if you start parsing it out philosophically, right? But fundamentally, I think one of the mistakes in a lot of Indian discourse on secularism, right, and why we have tied ourselves in knots about secularism, what does secularism mean, what is the opposite of secularism, is something I think Dr. Engineer, pointed out, which is that fundamentally secularism has to be tied to some conception of justice, right? It's not about how do we define secularism. Is there an Indian secularism? Is Indian secularism different from Western secularism, right? We can have those arcane debates endlessly. The core question that lies behind secularism is, in a sense, the question of justice, right? What are the terms on which we as citizens, who are all of equal dignity and free and equal, relate to each other, right? And somehow yet, I think, in a lot of the Indian discourse on secularism, this connection between secularism and justice has become severed. Secularism has become a kind of freestanding value in some senses, right? As opposed to what Jawaharlal Nehru used to think of it. Remember what he used to say about the Constitution? Why do we need the word secular? The whole thing is an architecture of secularism if you understand its complex architecture, its overlapping parts, and the fact that it tries to present a picture of justice. Right? So I'm not going to talk a lot about philosophical conceptions of secularism or what actually it means. What I'm going to do, and I do it a little bit apologetically, I am an academic, and academics have two tendencies. Whenever confronted with an actual problem, make the problem more abstract. And the second tendency, to borrow President Eisenhower's famous line, when you see a small problem, the only solution is to make the problem bigger. And what I'll try and do today is perhaps move a little bit out of the Indian perspective and think about where the crisis of Indian secularism actually stands in, you might say, a global conjuncture. And is there something deeper at play other than the crisis of our immediate politics, right, that we will have to confront with if we are going to think of a glorious, secular, just future for India? Now, it's not an accident, or it's not a surprise in this city of Mumbai that when you look around, you can just look around this college, this wonderful, magnificent college, right? You'll always have this sense of duality. on the one hand, there is no doubt India has a lot going for it, right? There is still an extraordinary dynamism. Whenever I feel depressed, I enter a classroom, and somehow in a classroom, all your doubts seem to vanish, at least in that space, right? Let's not forget, there are generations of Indians who are thinking of this time as a time of hope rather than some of the despair that I'll be talking about. I think that's a political reality we need to acknowledge, right? But underneath all of this dynamism and this sense of opportunity, many of us, at least I can speak personally, have this deep and profound sense that a poison is creeping in our souls. Not only is authoritarianism understood as the formal conduct of our public institutions increasing, but there is a kind of communal virus spreading that I think is a little bit unprecedented in Indian history. And why do I say unprecedented? I mean, you might say, look, what's new about communism, right? From 1857 onwards, at least. We have been debating this. We went through a cataclysm in the 1930s and 40s. We went through a cataclysm during the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, Gujarat riots. Dr.Asghar, engineer in some senses, catalogued its insidious and pervasiveness with truly remarkable scrupulousness. But when you compare this moment with that long arc of Indian history, I'll tell you why this moment fills me with more dread. So look, communalism has always existed. It is not a secret that Indian history is a deeply contested history over first the meaning of history itself, over which communities have political rights to this territory, over what should be the nature of our representation, over what should be the terms of our common life. And a lot of the stuff that we see in communal politics arises out of these deeply contested questions, as I'll kind of show about in a moment. And many of those divisions, those political differences, right, in the 1930s, for example, over the question of representation, right? Many of those political differences have translated into a communal politics that is profoundly violent and profoundly divisive. But what I find distinctive about this moment is that it's not a kind of communalism that can be reduced to political differences or can be reduced even to violence. There's almost a visceral and existential dread of otherness that seems to be creeping in. A kind of casualization and normalization of it, which I do think is unprecedented. It's unprecedented in the sense that it is being legitimized at the highest levels of governance, right? So it's one thing to say that social processes contain seeds of communalism within it, but we've never ever had a hegemonic political leadership that openly advocated institutionalizing it as a norm. Not in the 1930s, not even in the 1980s, right? That is unprecedented. Its institutionalization within structures of power and vigilante groups of violence within society, I think is far subtler, but is going to be far more insidious and far more perhaps dangerous, I think, in the long run. Right now, most of us can live with what I call the statistical illusion, right? I mean, compared to 2002, compared to the 1940s, where is there that massive explosion of violence that we associate with, right, historical episodes of communalism, right? And I think both the government and, frankly, large parts of civil society thrive on the statistical innocence, right? It allows us to sleep comfortably at night. And yet, if you just look around that slow poison, this is a story that is not going to end well. So what brought about this moment, right? Now, I've written elsewhere, so I won't go into that. We can talk about this moment in terms of the history of the last 15, 20 years, the political success of the BJP, the social, economic causes that made, in some ways, the rise of the BJP plausible. I can discuss some of that in question and answer. I'm not going to actually talk about that a minute here. I'm actually going to, in a sense, as I said, look at a longer arc of history and take a wider global lens to ask the question, is there perhaps a deeper challenge that confronts us beyond simply the political fortunes of the BJP? Now, one way of thinking about the present moment, if you ask what is the BJP's political agenda, right? What is the ideological goal that it hopes to achieve? And frankly, one thing you have to say about this party, it actually does exactly what it says it is going to do. In fact, I think the joke is on many of us who were, I think our confidence in Indian society was always that you can't possibly mean this, right? Now, one way of looking at that project is that it is actually trying to do pretty much what the rest of the world has done for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, right? Let's remember, the history of the 19th and 20th centuries is the history of the creation of the nation state as a dominant political form. Almost every nation state that has been created historically as a dominant political form has had a stamp of majoritarianism on it. Sometimes we don't see that majoritarianism because that minorities were expelled before the creation of that nation state, right? And one of the things we had hoped for India, we often think of India as an exceptional country. In some ways it is, remarkably exceptional in the way in which it sustained its democracy, in the social, economic, cultural character of India. But one of the things I think India's founding generation was acutely aware of was that if India wanted to avoid the catastrophes of Europe, because the nation-state form is a form that consistently produced catastrophe in Europe. It produced ethnic cleansing in 19th century Europe. You just have to look at the aftermath of the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire. The introduction of democracy after the dissolution of European empires has almost everywhere been accompanied by ethnic cleansing and homogenization of populations, right? But the hope of our founding generation was that India can, in some senses, avoid the catastrophes of Europe, right? If we try and reproduce the European nation-state, classical canonical European nation-state form in the subcontinent, its consequences can only be catastrophic. And one way of thinking about what the BJP is doing is exactly what the rest of the world has done for most of its history, right? Create a majoritarian nation-state, right? Where the foundations of that nation-state are a form of mutual identification among citizens, whose basis is that it will erase certain kinds of minorities and differences, right? And this is one of the reasons why, when the world looks at India from the outside in, I have to say it's actually a pretty conflicted perception. On the one hand, there is a lot of hand-wringing in places like the New York Times, right, about what's happening in India, authoritarianism, communalism. But actually, a lot of the rest of the world recognizes the Indian story as a story that is finally catching up with, in some senses, the rest of the world. But as I said, in conditions where the consequences of doing that will be catastrophic. So let me explain this point. And to do this, as I said, I will go a little bit abstract, but hopefully it'll enable us to think about why our current diagnosis of where we are somewhat inadequate. Now, to simplify a little bit, if you look at the history of the world from the 19th century to the present moment, there are very many different ways of carving it out, right? The big conflict between capitalism and communism during the Cold War. The contest between authoritarianism and democracy, right? The struggles for social justice. But there is one very paradoxical and sort of almost titanic struggle that is at the heart of modern history, right? And I think we need to understand the nature of this struggle to place the struggle over Indian secularism in context. So what is this struggle? What is the promise of modernity? On the one hand, the biggest promise of modernity is individual freedom and the liberation of individuals, right? To allow them the maximum possibilities for their own self-development under conditions they choose, right? There is a profound moral individualism at the core of not just modernity, it's actually also at the core of the Indian Constitution, I will argue. We can have this debate later on. What are the elements of this individualism? We all want individual material well-being, right? It's the big promise of modernity. Your material life as individuals will be better than your parents, right? That's our development growth dynamic. Modernity disembeds individuals from traditional social roles, right? An individual is something more than, something other than the traditional social role that they occupied. That's still a big struggle in India, right? Where, in a sense, the alignment between traditional caste and social roles is still much more deeper than it should be. But you get the general point, right? What is the struggle for? In some senses, it is liberating individuals from the tyranny of social roles. We've invented individuals as the bearer of rights, right? The unit, the social unit to which rights are accorded, whose the preservation, whose dignity is the function of our Constitution, in some senses is the individual. Aesthetics, right? I mean, it's actually a remarkable feature about modernity that modern art also places a great deal of emphasis on individual subjectivity and meaning. The purpose of art is not just the objective representation of common life, right? The purpose of art, in a sense, is to be expressive of subjective meaning. In politics, democracy, what is the core of democracy? The core of democracy is that any citizen can engage qua individual in the practices of justification and discussion. When Dr. Ambedkar defines democracy, what is central to his imagination of democracy is government by discussion and justification, right? Nothing is immune from questioning, and nobody is excluded from questioning it. Yes, the promise of this liberatory project is constrained by social and material inequality. That's one of the big contradictions of modernity. But you get the general point, right? That what drives modernity, right? This struggle we have, which we call secularism, is actually a struggle for the expansion of the space for and dignity of the individual. So that's one side. But here's the paradox. The very same movement, right? The very same experience of modernity that promises that expansion of individual freedom also at the same time imprisons us in new forms of collective identity, right? You can think of race. You can think of the nation-state form. Some would argue even class, right? You can think of the transformation of religion into a new form of ethnic identification. So it's not true that Hinduism was invented in the 19th century, but it is true that the idea of the Hindu as an ethnic category, right, is in a sense a product of the 19th century. And if you think about the lives that we live, the scripts that we inhabit in our lives, on the one hand, right, we all want this freedom for self-definition. That's the ultimate utopian ambition of modernity, right? What can be sweeter than the power to define yourself, right? Including defining your own gender, your own, identity, your own class, right? And yet, the daily disciplines of our lives, in almost every institution that we inhabit, are actually marked by these collective scripts and compulsory identities. You have a passport. You can't, in a sense, travel without the marker of that collective identity, right? Which you do not have the power to self-define, right? In a nation-state system, right? The way in which the state might materially distribute benefits, right? If you think about it, there's an even deeper paradox here. So when the 19th century revolutionary tradition, of which secularism is, I think, one product, started out, there was this extraordinary hope that what does justice mean, right? Justice, in a sense, means that we as citizens are able to collectively define the terms on which we live with one another, right? In fact, in the 19th century, people used to think of nature as constraining, right? Nature is fixed. Nature is the realm of necessity. And nature is what provides limits to what we can do. The social realm, on the other hand, was meant to be this realm of freedom, right? We can make and unmake institutions. We can make and unmake the categories of our collective life. But here's one of, I think, the most monumental ironies of the 21st century, is it turned out we actually spend far more time making and unmaking nature, pretending that there are no natural limits to what we need to do, pretending that there are no fixities in nature. This is now coming to haunt us. And pretending that as an infrastructure species, right, nature, the dominance and conquest of nature is something on which we can exercise our freedom, right? So, yet if you think about society, almost the reverse happened. So many of the categories of our social life, the nature and organization of capitalism, the nature and organization of the nation state, this kind of enduring structure of the last 150 years, these seem to us to be immutable, right? We operate within their horizons. They seem to set limits on what we can think. They seem to set bounds on our freedom, right? They have, in some senses, become the fixed points, right? So we are inhabiting, if you like, a modern social experience that, as I said, is fundamentally paradoxical. This great emancipation of the quest for self-definition, right? And yet, at every step, forms of social existence being constrained by institutions and categories which we think we are powerless to change. I'm not saying nothing has changed. I mean, you can think of the radical reconstitution of the family, for example, as a site where individual freedom has immensely expanded, right? The modern family is unrecognizable in many ways, right? Or at least the terms in which we struggle for its transformation. And yet, right? Our social scripts are so constituted by these categories and traps. Now, here comes the more difficult part. You might say, as Dr. Watson, as Sherlock Holmes said of Dr. Watson, to Dr. Watson, your grasp of the obvious amazes me, right? What's so obvious? I mean, sometimes even the obvious needs to be said. But here is the more difficult part. And I think if you're going to think about a project of secularism going ahead, this is, I think, the difficulty that we need to confront. Which is our feeling trapped in these categories and in these forms of social institutions over whom we are not able to exercise collective power, right, is actually a product of many of the good things in modernity that we want, and which is why it's so hard to shake them off, right? So think of democracy. A modern conception of democracy requires horizontal solidarity. It requires much higher degree of mutual identification among citizens. It requires clearer conceptions of membership. And it requires that democracies understand themselves as communities of fate. This is quite a burden to place on democracy. But what's the result of this? Democracies require the constitution of a people, right? And a conception of the people that in some ways has to measure up to all of these things that in some senses I articulated. Almost nowhere in the 20th century has that conception of a people been created without deep ethnic exclusion. What we call the problem of communalism, I think Dr. Engineer was on to something, is actually a problem that comes out of democracy. Not in the superficial sense that we understand it, that politicians will exploit communal sentiments for votes, right? It is a problem that comes out of democracy because there is no straightforward normative answer to the question, and this has been the historical weakness of liberal theory. Who gets included and excluded in the conception of the people, right? Take a second way in which these categories imprisoned us, and that's why we are searching for these scripts of people. Take modern forms of knowledge, as any sociologist will tell you, right? Most modern social science, most modern understanding of social categories, right, in a sense tends to classify people, right? Our business as social scientists would, in some senses, we'd be out of business if we were not in the business of classifying people, right? Now, formally, all of us say these categories are contingent, right? There are particular choices made by, right? Particular researchers. These classifications can be changed, right? Individuals are subject to multiple identities and classifications. And yet, the very mode of classification, the very mode of enumeration, think of the census, for example, right? Itself condemns you to particular identities and particular scripts and narratives, right? Yeah. So what I'm trying to suggest, this slightly kind of roundabout way, and I'll come to the political punchline, hopefully in some senses in a second, right? Is that the modern struggle for secularism and justice is in some sense a struggle against this duality. that on the one hand, we all want individual freedom, and yet the structures of our life will consistently imprison us in newer and newer categories. Think of the category of the nation, for example. Right? You know, Gibbon used to have this joke about religion, that in Rome, all the philosophers think religions are false, all the people think it's true, and all the politician thinks it's useful. Right? In a sense, the category of the nation, for us, has come to perform that same function. Right? It's, by the way, the only category that I know of that can consecrate death the way in which religion does. Right? But, here's the crucial point. You might say, if nations are contingent creations, why is it so difficult to shake off their hold and all the exclusions that, in some senses, that come with it? Why is it? What is the appeal? Where we are willing to give our life for a script that condemns us to three things. It condemns us to an abstract identity, right? A nation is an abstraction. It condemns us to a vicarious form of excitement, right? Virat Kohli's 6 gives me thrills, right? I've actually done nothing to hit that 6. Right? There's a kind of vicariousness built into national identification. That is part of its appeal. That's one of the reasons why an abstract concept of humanity can never compete with, in a sense, the abstraction of the nation. Right? Where is the vicarious thrill that humanity produces in a way in which that nation does? And it fundamentally places you in a competitive relationship, not just with other nations, but internally also in terms of competing with other groups over who gets to control the meaning of this term nation. Now, if you think about the identity trap we are in, the identity trap we are in is that we cannot or find it very difficult to forego a form of collective existence, right? That condemns us to this abstract identification. And because it is an abstract identification, there will be a script with it, right? How is it that all of us, right, who on the one hand yearn for self-definition in our individual lives, right, completely want to forego the quest for self-definition at the collective level, right? How is it that all of us, right, who care so much about our individual well-being, individual freedom, individual subjective states, are attracted to a form of living and identification that I said is fundamentally vicarious, right? Of which we are not even agents in some significant sense, right? And how is it that we naturalize and condemn ourselves to categories where the very act of classification puts us in a competitive relationship with other groups, right? And I think, to me, in a sense, it's not an accident that if you look at modernity from this angle, what is the horror that modernity has produced? As I said, it has created the conditions for individual liberation and self-definition, but it has also created the conditions where the thing that is most effaced and most obscured is that very individual, right? In a communal riot, or in the extreme case, a genocide, right? What is being erased and effaced? Not just a community. Of course, a particular community is being targeted for being simply who they are. But what is fundamentally being effaced is the idea that there is an individual behind this collective script that we have imposed, not just on others, but we have imposed on ourselves as a condition for engaging in communal violence. If you read memoirs of Holocaust survivors, one of the most astonishingly moving and unbearable things you can read is many Holocaust survivors would report that the first thing they tried to do once they survived was look at themselves in a mirror, right? And what were they looking for in the mirror, right? Not abstract humanity, but the creases on their face. Something that would allow them that space to say, I'm actually an individual in my own right. I have been targeted because I'm a member of a particular group. Absolutely, right? You can't disavow that group identification, right? Particularly if you're being targeted simply for being a member of a particular group. But what is the moral core of that targeting, right? Is that who you are can be completely effaced and exhausted, right? By that act of classification and naming. If I name your caste, if I name your nationality, if I name your religion, name any collective category, I need not say anything more or anything less. Yeah? Now, our political response to this, I'll just pick an example. Amartya Sen's great book, Identity and Violence, right, is to often say, but look, surely one of the mistakes we make here is that people inhabit multiple identities. And that by reducing them to one identity and targeting them for who they are in virtue of that identity, we are in some senses negating their multiple identities and our own multiple identities. So, we have gender, we belong to different classes, different regions. You can create multiple identities. I have increasingly come to the view that the answer to the singularity of that act of targeting isn't simply going to be a recognition of multiplicity and multiple identities, right? This is for two reasons. One, of course, we can all easily acknowledge that we have multiple attributes, and yet argue that in order to act as an effective agent of history, we need to put our attributes in a hierarchy such that one of these attributes becomes the controlling hierarchical attribute that I have. In modern circumstances, usually it's nationalism and the nation state, right? That's, in a sense, the identity to live for, that's the identity to die for, that's the identity which then, in a sense, frames large parts of your existence. But there is an even deeper, I think, fallacy in that multiplicity response, because the multiplicity response shares the same feature, right, with this monomaniacal communalist, which is both of them are quite compatible with objectifying identity. The problem is not whether we are singular or multiple, right? The problem is each of our multiplicities, right? If we present them as objective facts about ourselves, yes, they're objective facts that matter to us, but if we try and define them, right, they themselves commit us to a politics of benchmarks. So I can very confidently say I'm a Hindu, Jain, Vaishnav, Rajasthani, male, Xavierite. I can run through these identities. And yet, the act of naming each one of them itself will immediately invite the next question. Okay, in what sense are you Jain? What makes you a Muslim? Right? What makes you a Xavierite? Right? Is that a legal category that you have a certificate from St. Xavier's, like CA, Kagaz Dikhao? Or is that imbibing the spirit of St. Xavier's? Right? The point I'm trying to make in some ways is that the fallacy of the monomaniacal nationalist is that they want to hold people to a particular benchmark, right? Whether it's ethnicity, whether it's language, whether it's religion, whatever that benchmark is. But the invocation of multiple sub-identities will also expose you to precisely those benchmarks. So you can run Tamil nationalism or Kashmiri nationalism against Indian nationalism. I'm both Kashmiri and Indian. Absolutely, great. I'm, Tamil and Indian. I'm Rajasthani and Indian. And yet, it will immediately commit you, as you can see in the politics of sub-regions, to another politics of benchmarking and objectification, right? You often go to music concerts these days or artistic galleries, and there's a kind of response that people have to art, which is a kind of sociological reduction. So, faced with the Hindutva narrative of Indian history, we all like these moments of syncretism. Oh, here's a Muslim musician singing a Hindu bhajan, or here's a form of music that has origins in different traditions. And I think as historical and sociological matters, right, these stories are important to be told, right? This whole idea of Ganga, Jamuna, Tehjeeb, right? But again, if you think about it for a minute, this response also shares that same process of colonization of meaning by identity and benchmarking it to an identity that the nationalist is subjecting to you. This thing is interesting because it's a confluence of two identities, right? One of the remarkable things about nationalism and the politics of identity is that it can actually colonize meaning across a realm of activities. Right? Right? Why is this art important? Because it is mine. Right? Because it is Indian. Right? Why is this idea important? Because it's Indian. Not because of the autonomous logic or meaning of that idea. Simply adding multiple identities to that actually does not negate that logic of benchmarking and objectification. It can actually unwittingly reinforce it, right? Now, why is all this, I think, important, this last kind of closing, which is that I think if the politics of secularism is to have a future in India, we obviously need to do all the immediate political things we need to do. Act with courage, organize, vote for the right parties, try and convince even our closest family members that being complicit with evil is not an option. Try and convince so many of our fellow citizens, right, who probably do not want to participate in evil, but do not think minor acts of evil are deal breakers as far as their politics. We have to do all of that stuff, right? I mean, that stuff, CSS, all of you are in some senses much better at, right? But what we will have to do, I think, fundamentally in the long run, is break away from an image of secularism that I think still dominates much of our politics, well-intentioned, which thinks of secularism as, in a sense, a project of harmony between communities, right? Even the phrase communal harmony, in some senses, carries that paradoxical ring to it, right? There are communities who need to, in some senses, live in harmony with each other. I think one of the things Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer, I think, realized, he probably would have not approved of the language in which I'm articulating it, right, is that language of communal harmony, right, simply kicks the can down the road, because in an insidious way, what it can do is it can re-institutionalize and normalize, right, the naturalization of communal categories, right? This, in a sense, public naturalization. Oh, here's a Muslim embracing a Hindu. Oh, here's a Hindu reading, in some senses, a Muslim text or something. When Dara Shikoh wrote Majma'ul Bahrain, right, this really extraordinary text, right, where he makes this extraordinary claim that reading the Upanishads better gets him to better understand the Quran, right? The most important point he was making in Majma'ul Bahrain was not that the text is the meeting of two traditions, right? That's our dominant metaphor for communal harmony, right? Ganga, Jamna, Tehzeeb. Majma'ul Bahrain, the meeting of two traditions. The most important philosophical point he was making is that the moment of genuine enlightenment is the moment where you can actually transcend that identity trap. The moment of enlightenment is not that the two have met. The moment of enlightenment is that moment where you can actually overcome the limitation of that script. It's not, I'm Hindu or Muslim, right? And now I just add Hindu plus Muslim or something, right? It is that moment where these categories are ladders that you can kick away to a much more expansive form of existence and self-definition, right? Okay? That project of radical self-definition in some ways, that I think in part modernity in some ways promises. But that project of radical self-definition, that moment of enlightenment, is not moving from the abstraction of nation, religion, caste, class, to the abstraction of humanity. That's also an abstraction, and it will always lose, because it can never produce the kind of vicarious thrills that nationalism does. The real moment of enlightenment, right? What do you transcend to? What you transcend to is the moment where you can recognize each particularity and individuality for what it is, right? Where no set of categories, no scripts, including ones that you have given to yourselves, limit your horizons or the moral imagination within which you operate. And I think what has been missing from Indian secularism, right? I think communal harmony has been there, peace has been there, is that solicitous concern for individuality, the concern for the crease on everyone's face which is different, the lines on everyone's palms that are different. In that sense, actually, astrologers are much more concerned about individuality, paradoxically, I think, than most of us social scientists are, right? Okay. And how do we, in some senses, invent a politics, invent a public policy, right? Invent a form of relating with each other that does not commit us to be bound by these identities. It doesn't matter whether they're single, multiple, or not, right? I think that's, in a sense, I think the question Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer, I think if I read his interpretations of the Quran, I think was leaving us with. This is going to be a difficult challenge, but as Italo Calvino once said, there are two ways to escape infernos, and we are in the middle of an inferno. The first is easy for many, which is we accept the inferno and become a part of it, which many of us increasingly are. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension, right? Such that we recognize that we are in the midst of that inferno and give ourselves space to preserve what is enduring and valuable. And what is most enduring and more valuable is actually the individuality that lies at the end of the human quest, not any naturalized category, whether it's the category of social science or what our politicians bequeath us. Thank you.